Hey everyone, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and welcome to part 27 of my ultimate guide to Logic Pro. In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of how to use the Compressor plugin in Logic, and I'll also explain what compression is and how to use each of the parameters within a compressor. And even if you don't use Logic's compressor plugin, many of these topics are still applicable to other compressor plugins. Now, this video is going to be a really long one, probably the longest video in the series, so as always, I've left timestamps and chapters below if you want to jump around. And I've also included a link to download this demo project for free if you want to work along with me and practice using compression in a mix. So first, what is a compressor? Well, a compressor is a dynamics processing unit that can be used to control or shape the volume of a track over time. So with an EQ, we use this to shape the frequency spectrum. A compressor is used to shape the dynamics. So for example, on the lead vocal track here, there are some pretty stark differences between the peak loudest moments in the vocal and the softer points in the vocal. The goal of a compressor, on a vocal at least, is to make sure that the dynamic range between these peak points and these softer points is lessened. So you want the dynamics to be more smooth and you want to make them a bit more uniform so that every word that is sung can be clearly understood and heard. Compressors do this by applying gain reduction to the signal in real time based on the settings within the compressor. So Logic's compressor has the ability to view the gain reduction as a meter or in graph mode. Let me show you what that looks like real quick.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies.
So before I even break down each of the controls within the compressor, let's hear an example of what compression can do for a vocal track. So what I'm going to do is bypass the compressor for now, and I'm just going to play the vocal as is so you can hear the full dynamic range of the vocal. And then I'll bring the compressor in and play the vocal again so you can hear the effect of the compressor. So first, this is bypassed.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through tragedies. I took the brunt of your shame and all your misery.
Okay, let's activate the compressor. Let's hear that again.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies. I took the brunt of your shame and all your misery.
So the white line is showing you the amount of gain reduction taking place in real time. The higher the signal level, the more gain reduction is applied, resulting in a more dynamically balanced vocal. You can also see this in meter view. You can see that we're applying up to about 7 dB, actually up into the 10 dB of reduction range at some of the louder points in the vocal. So it's all about controlling the dynamics, but controlling it in a musical way. You don't want things completely slammed like a limiter would, because in many situations that'll just sound bad. Now, this same concept can apply to other instruments, but when it comes to more percussive instruments like drums, the goal might be to make the dynamics more punchy, maybe making the kick or snare drum transients cut through the mix a bit better. So compression is not always used in the same way on every instrument, and compression is certainly not a requirement for all instruments in a mix, but I almost always find myself adding some amount of compression to vocals, bass guitar, acoustic instruments, and drums, which are the instruments that I'm going to apply compression to in this video. Next, I want to talk about these circuit types up here, but before I get into the circuit types, I actually want to add the compressor to a kick drum track. So in the previous video, we broke up the drums into multiple outputs. So here's the kick track. So I'm just going to solo that, and I'm going to add the compressor after the channel EQ here. The reason why I'm using a kick drum to demonstrate this is I find that the fundamentals of compression are most easily taught with a kick drum, because the transient in the kick drum is very clearly defined, and it's just very easy to understand what the compressor is actually doing, as opposed to putting it on a vocal, which is a very, dynamically complex signal. Okay, so these different modes up here are actually different circuit types. These are modeled compression circuits that are meant to emulate the sound of various different types of well-known hardware compressors, although they are not exact models. The Platinum Digital is just digital compression, so it's very surgical, very transparent, and very exact. The rest of these I'm going to kind of explain out of order. The next one I want to show you is the Vintage Opto. This is what I was using on the lead vocal. Optical compressors will typically use tubes as well as optical cells to apply their compression. So the result is you get a very smooth compression, which is why these are typically the go-to compression type for vocals. I also like using them on bass guitar quite a bit, but it has a really slow reaction time, meaning that it takes a little bit of extra time to actually apply the gain reduction. The Vintage Opto circuit is based on the Teletronics LA2A compressor, which has now been reissued by Universal Audio. Next up are the FET circuits. There's two of these. There's a Studio FET and a Vintage FET. FET stands for Field Effect Transistor. This is a solid-state modeled circuit, meaning that it's not modeling the sound of any tubes, because FET compression is inherently solid-state and uses transistors rather than tubes. These are often called limiting amplifiers because they are great at limiting peak transients in a more surgical way than you can achieve with an optical compressor, because they have a much faster reaction time than opto circuits do. However, they tend to color the signal a bit more than an opto circuit would. The Studio FET is based on the Yuri Blackface 1176, and the Vintage FET is based on the Yuri Blue Stripe 1176. These have been reissued and cloned by various different companies over the years as well. I actually have hardware clone versions of both of these in my rack, the Stam Audio 76D Plus, which is like the Studio FET, and the Black Lion Bluey, which is like the Vintage FET. And lastly, we have the three VCA circuits. VCA stands for Voltage Controlled Amplifier, and these are also solid-state compressors, but instead of transistors, they use VCAs. These will typically be more transparent than FET compressors, but they do have a faster reaction time than the Vintage Opto circuit as well. These are great for bus compression, meaning that you would combine the signal of multiple tracks together and compress them all together. We'll come back to this in a future video very soon when I show you how to use track stacks. So the Studio VCA is based on the Focusrite Red 3 compressor. The Classic VCA is based on the original DBX 160 compressor. And the Vintage VCA is based on the SSL bus compressor. Now, I don't want you to get so wrapped up in the different circuit types that you lose focus on how to actually use a compressor. So for now, what I'll say is, if you're not sure what circuit type to use for a particular instrument, just use the Platinum Digital, dial in a setting that you like, and then cycle through each of the circuit types and just listen for how the compressor shapes the dynamics and how it shapes the tone of the signal, and use the circuit that sounds best to your ear. There are no hard and fast rules about what circuit should be used for any given instrument. I typically will use Vintage Opto for bass, guitar, and vocals. I'll typically use FET compression for like individual drum tracks. I'll use VCA compression for stereo recordings, acoustic recordings, maybe an entire drum kit, maybe the cymbals on the drum kit. But again, there are no hard and fast rules. You can use any of these circuits on anything. Just use your ear and use the one that sounds best for your specific situation. Next, let's jump into the compressor controls. The main two controls in a compressor that control the amount of compression taking place are the threshold and ratio. The compression ratio is the amount of compression applied to the signal. So if you set this to 1:1, this means that no compression is taking place. The input signal is the same level as the output signal. So if I play my kick track here, you'll see the signal coming through in the graph, but you'll see no gain reduction applied to each of the kick hits. And as I roll up the compression ratio, you'll see more and more compression applied to the signal. The threshold is equally as important as the ratio because it determines where the signal level will be compressed, where if the signal passes above the threshold, it will be compressed, and if the signal does not pass above the threshold, it will not be compressed. The lower the threshold, the more signal will pass above the threshold. Therefore, more of the signal will be able to be compressed based on the setting you set with the compression ratio. If I have a threshold of 0, no signal is going to pass above the threshold, and therefore no compression will take place, regardless of what I have my ratio set to. And if I start pulling down the threshold and more signal passes the threshold, allowing those transients that are passing the threshold to be compressed based on the ratio. So to sum this up in simple terms, if you have a low threshold and a high ratio, this will result in more compression taking place. If you have a high threshold and a low ratio, this will result in less compression taking place. So this would be like a gentle compression setting, and this would be like a heavy compression setting. Let me demonstrate that real quick. So we have some really gentle compression here at a 3:1 ratio and a -14 threshold. Let's try pulling down the threshold a bit more, and we'll get even more compression. Yeah, so now we're getting almost 20 dB of gain reduction. It's probably not a practical setting that we would actually use, but I just wanted to show that to you so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about with more compression and less compression. Next up, I want to talk about the makeup gain, the input gain, and the output gain. If you find that your recorded signal is a little bit too soft, like you're really having to crank the threshold way down because the signal is kind of low, you can increase the input gain here, which will just increase the level of the signal as it enters the compressor. That's all that does. And likewise, on the output, you can also add gain on the output after the entire compressor circuit. However, gain, at least added gain, is typically applied with a makeup gain control. As you pull down the threshold and pull up the ratio and apply more compression, the volume, or at least the peak volume of the signal, is going to be much lower than it was on input. So if you look at the input and output meter, with more compression, you'll see that the output is significantly lower than the input, about 3 dB lower, 2 dB lower than the output. So what you can do with the makeup gain is you can turn off the auto gain and add or reduce gain to the signal after the compression is applied. This will come in really handy, especially when we come back to the vocals, because as you compress the vocals, they're going to kind of get buried in the mix. So you can use the makeup gain to sort of compensate for that and bring the vocals back out to the front. Logic's compressor has an auto gain function where if you turn this off, you're basically not affecting the gain of the signal after the compression in any way, except that you can dial it in manually with the makeup gain. The auto gain 0 and -12 dB options will automatically compensate for the volume loss that you get by compressing the signal. Although I find that the auto gain is generally too loud, so I almost never use it. I typically will just turn this off and dial in my own makeup gain because I typically only need a little bit, or if the signal's too loud, you can dial it back a bit. Or what you can do is you can use this in conjunction with the auto gain. You could set this maybe to -12 and then pull back the makeup gain rather than adding makeup gain. So you can see with makeup gain off, the signal's significantly lower, so I'm gonna have to pull the makeup gain into the positive rather than the negative. Personally, like I said, I almost never use the auto gain because I don't really find it that helpful, at least in this plugin. Next, let's talk about the attack and release parameters. The attack and release parameters have to do with time rather than amount. So the attack time is how quickly the compressor will react to transients that pass the threshold. So if you want to compress more of the transients and you want to tame the transient in this kick drum, you would set the attack time to a lower setting, to a faster setting, which means that the signal is going to sort of immediately be compressed. Whereas if you set this to a slower attack time, the reaction time of the compressor is going to be slower, and therefore it's going to let some of the transient through before the signal is compressed. Let me show you what I mean here because it's much easier to hear than it is to explain. So the kick drum sounds like really sort of boomy, and that front end punch is sort of gone because the signal is immediately being compressed. If I start rolling this up, this is going to let some of the front end transient through. So with drums, I tend to roll up the attack a bit to let some of the punch of the transient through. And then the compressor will be mainly acting on sort of the tail of each drum hit rather than the front end of each drum hit. We want the drums to be punchy, and a way to make drums sound more punchy is to roll back the attack time and let some of that transient through. The release time controls the amount of time it takes for the signal to sort of release the signal or let go of the signal or stop compressing the signal once it falls below the threshold. So if you set a fast release time, the signal is going to be compressed above the threshold, but as soon as the signal passes below the threshold, it's very quickly going to stop being compressed. Whereas if you set a longer release time, it'll take a bit longer for the signal to stop being compressed. So for drums, I'll typically use a pretty long release because I want the tail end of each drum hit to be really compressed, but I want the front end attack, the front end transient to come through. And there's also an auto button, which is really helpful because it automatically adjusts the release time. It sort of makes the release time variable rather than fixed based on the content that is coming through the compressor. For now, just for demonstration, I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to play around with the attack and release time so you can see what this does to the kick drum. So if you want to hear more of like the body of the kick drum, just like the boominess of the kick, you'd use a shorter attack and a shorter release. But if I want more of that front end punch and I want to tame the sort of tail end of the drum hits, I would pull both of these up a bit. Now, you don't want your release time to be too slow because it'll just take too long for the signal to stop being compressed. And this will result in overlapping releases where the release time of one kick hit is affecting the attack time of the next kick hit. So you have to sort of find a sweet spot for both the attack and release time. And this sweet spot will vary for each instrument. Next up, let's talk about the knee control. The knee controls the amount of compression applied to signals that are close to the threshold. Not all of the circuits even have a knee option, and the knee is kind of like a secondary parameter of the threshold. So if you pull this over to the right, this is what's called a soft knee. So if it's over at 1, that's a soft knee. And if you look at the graph here, you'll see that the curve is a soft curve. So as you go from linear input and output, so no compression, to the threshold where the signal is being compressed, there's this soft sort of transition between no compression and compression. And if I pull this over to the left, this is what's known as a hard knee. So there's like a hard break in the signal from no compression to threshold where the signal is compressed. So with a soft knee, signals that are just above the threshold will be compressed a little bit differently, a bit softer than signals that are well above the threshold. If you use a hard knee, signals that are just over the threshold will be compressed the same as signals that are well over the threshold. So as a general rule, if you're not sure, just set it in the middle and you'll be fine. But if you're working with instruments where you want things to be very precise, like individual drum tracks like kick, snare, toms, these can often benefit from a hard knee, whereas I find almost everything else benefits from a soft knee. You just get a bit better dynamic treatment, so things like vocals, acoustic instruments, these will benefit from a soft knee. But for a kick drum like this, I'm going to opt to go with a more hard knee. It's pretty subtle, but with a hard knee, you can hear each of the kick hits are sort of being compressed the same. Whereas on the right, with a soft knee, the softer kick hits are kind of being left alone, whereas the harder kick hits are being compressed more intentionally. So I'm going to leave this over on the hard knee side for the kick drum. So those are the main compressor parameters. Let's check out some of these parameters here. We have a limiter that's built into the compressor, and you can set a threshold for that limiter here. A limiter, think of it like a compressor where the ratio is like 100 to 1 or infinity to 1. It's essentially a compressor that doesn't let any signal pass the threshold. This can be used if you're trying to control peaks that are clipping, although a better option is just simply to pull down the output gain or don't apply so much makeup gain. So I almost never find myself using the limiter in the compressor unless I'm trying to, create some sort of a special effect. But let me just show you it in action so you can see what it does. So I had the threshold set at -1, so none of the peaks were going beyond -1 dB on output. And every time the limiter is being used or it's engaged, you'll see the limiter light up in red. So I'm going to turn that off. I'll pull the makeup gain back down. And let's talk about the distortion unit, which is very interesting. So the distortion unit can be used to add some like clipping distortion, either soft, hard, or fully clipped distortion to the signal. With drums, this can help to add a little bit of noise, a little bit of distortion on the peaks of each of the transients, which can give each drum hit a bit more definition and punch. And I find the soft distortion to actually be the most noticeable, but I'll just go through all of these and demonstrate all of the distortion modes along with distortion off. Now, the mix knob is a mix blend knob. This allows you to apply parallel compression to the signal without having to do any complicated, signal chain arrangement with the sends and using aux tracks. This lets you do all of this directly within the compressor plugin, which I absolutely love. So what this does is on the far right, this means at 100%, this means that you're hearing 100% of the compressed signal. All the way to the left, 0%, this means you're hearing only the input. So you're hearing the signal without any compression applied to it. So with parallel compression, a parallel compression technique, this involves blending the dry signal, the unaffected signal, with the wet signal, the affected signal, and sort of dialing in a parallel compression setting that sounds best, especially with drums. Sometimes it sounds best to blend your wet and dry signals together for the best result. I also find it helpful because with parallel compression, you can really slam the signal with some pretty heavy compression for a more dramatic effect, and then just dial back the mix blend to reduce that effect. Like I would never use a compression setting like this on the kick just as is. It's too much. But if I blend in some of the dry signal, it creates a much more musical effect, essentially blending the punch of the compressor with the body and tone of the dry signal. Okay, so now that I've got a compressor setting I like, I'm going to cycle through all of the circuit types just so you can see what each one sounds like on kick drum, and I'm going to pick the circuit that I think sounds best. The digital circuit is certainly applying the most noticeable effect, whereas the others tend to be a bit more smooth. The VCAs are like pretty natural sounding. The Opto's pretty natural sounding with like a harder pop, a little harder transient. But I think the Studio FET sounds best here. I may actually use a little bit more of the compressed signal and a little less of the dry signal. Okay, so let's move on to the snare. For this, I want to beef it up and give it a bit more punch. So once again, I'll start with the Platinum Digital, and then after I dial in a compression setting I like, I'll go through the different circuit types. So with the compressor in, we're getting like a noticeable punch or smack in the snare drum, whereas without the compressor, even though it's louder right now, you're hearing more of the snares and the fizzle of the snare drum. And let's go ahead and just blend this in. I'm going to add some soft distortion and blend this in with the mix blend. Yeah, here I think I like the Platinum Digital the most. And you'll find that, especially with electronic music, you'll find that the Platinum Digital is the best option in a lot of cases. It's a very capable compressor. Okay, so let's jump up to the vocals, and I'll show you how I would dial in a compressor for vocals, sort of like a general purpose, vocal compression setting. I've removed the compressor that I had on there before, so I'm going to go ahead and add that back to the channel strip. And I'm sure there'll be questions about whether to add EQ first, then compression second, or compression first, EQ second. I really don't want to sit and argue about what's better, but I typically use EQ before compression, at least on vocals. But there are many people who swear by compression first, EQ second. What I'll say is try both and use whichever sounds best. If EQ second sounds best, go with it. If EQ first sounds best, go with it. Okay, so I'm going to go straight to the vintage Opto circuit here. And what I'm going to do is just sort of dial this in by ear. I'm not looking for a really heavy compression on the vocals, but I do want to tame a lot of these peak moments in the vocal where the vocal's getting pretty loud. So I'm going to try to tame down those points.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was made.
So one thing I want to point out here is even with a negative 26 threshold and an 8-to-1, an almost 8-to-1 ratio, we're barely getting any compression. And that's because the signal on this vocal is probably a little low. So what we can do to compensate for that is we can pull up the input gain to make the starting point a little louder. We may have to reduce the output gain and maybe not apply so much makeup gain later, but at least this will give us a healthier signal so we don't have to crank the threshold all the way down and crank the ratio all the way up in order to get any compression. Let's try that again.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies. I took the brunt of your shame and all your misery.
Now, again, if you feel like the signal is not being, or the vocal is not being compressed long enough, you may need to increase the release time, and you can get away with some longer release times with non-percussive instruments like this. So at a faster release setting, it seems like it's compressing, but it's like very quickly letting go of the signal. So here I'm going to opt to go with a bit longer or a little slower release time, but I'll start with a short release just so you can hear what both of these options sound like. And I'll start with the vocal soloed, and then I'll bring in the rest of the mix.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies. I took the brunt of your shame and all your misery. I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies. I took the...
And if you're looking for a really present vocal, you can try adding in the soft distortion. Although for my vocal here in this context, I don't think it's really working out too well. So I just put that back on off. Now, I'm not going to use the mix blend here at all, but I do want to show you something. I want to show you visually what the compression does to the waveform. So what I'm going to do is just select this track, hit Control B to bounce this in place. I'll bounce this to a new track. I'll leave the original, and I will not bypass any of the effects plugins. And what this is going to do is it's going to show the waveform of the signal after it's been compressed. So you can see we've achieved our goal of taking some of these more peak loud moments and pulling them down. And we've also succeeded at taking some of these softer moments and pulling them up. So the dynamics overall are smoother and more uniform. However, one thing you're going to see here is a lot of these waveforms still have these little peaks, these little hard peaks on them. And that's due to the nature of an optical compressor. It has a slow reaction time, a slow attack time. So a trick I like to do with vocals is I'll have the optical compression first, doing the majority of the work. And then after the vocal compressor, I'll actually add a second compressor, and I'll typically use one of the FET circuits, or I'll use the Platinum Digital circuit. And this compressor is just catching the little peaks in the vocal, just rounding off and smoothing out those peaks.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how I...
So to do this, I'm using the Studio FET here. I'm using a very quick attack and a very quick release just to duck down those peaks in that vocal. Now to see this visually, I'm going to go ahead and just bounce and place this vocal one more time. So the one on top is the completely uncompressed signal. The one in the middle is just with optical compression, and the one on the bottom is with 2 stages of compression. Optical to control the overall dynamics, and the FET circuit to control some of these peaks. And you can see how that peak has been ducked down, and you can see that the dynamic of the vocal overall is much more uniform than what we started with.
Now that you're sober, don't tell me that it's over. Don't turn this ship around and tell me that you can't give one more day. Don't ever tell me why.
Now, if the vocal sounds maybe like it's a little over compressed, you can try pulling back the mix blend here, so we get a bit more of a gentle effect. You could even do this within the opto circuit as well, just to give the vocals a bit more dynamics.
Now that you're sober, don't tell me that it's over. Don't turn this ship around and tell me that you can't give one more day. Don't ever tell me why. Don't you ever tell me why. 'Cause I don't want to know. I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies. I took the brunt of your shame and all your misery.
Yeah, so the vocals are standing out in the mix. I can hear every single word that I'm singing very clearly. And on top of all that, the compressors are adding sort of like a mojo, like a vibe to the vocal that they didn't have before. Bass, I often find having trouble controlling the dynamics, although this bass looks actually pretty uniform. Often what'll happen is when the bass player plays more in the middle of the neck, you'll get more bass and more, just the signal will be louder. Whereas if they play more open strings, the signal won't quite be as loud. So it's helpful to add compression to bass to control these things. Although the bass amp designer itself actually has a compressor built into it, although I'm not using it at all in this example. So let's try compressing the bass a bit and see if we can maybe beef up the bass a bit more. I'm going to add the compressor after the EQ once again, and I'm going to use the opto circuit. So it's sort of taming the transients, but bringing out the ring and the sustain of each of the notes. Of course, I'm giving it a little bit of a volume boost as well with the makeup gain.
I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies.
And I may want to do something similar with the guitars. Maybe I want to, give these a bit more body, make the dynamics a bit more uniform. Let's try out the Studio VCA on the acoustic guitar here. So if you want less of the transients, you'd pull down the attack time. If you want the transients to kind of come through more, you can pull up the attack, which is what I'm going to do. And you don't have to apply a lot of compression to get a good result. You can hear there, it sounds fine without the compression, but with the compression, it's got more body. It's, the dynamics are a little more uniform. Everything in the performance stands out a bit better than it did without the compression. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this over to my other acoustic guitar track just by holding Option and dragging it over. Okay, let's hear this whole thing from the beginning now.
Now that you're sober, don't tell me that it's over. Don't turn the ship around and tell me that you can't give one more day. Don't ever tell me why. Don't you ever tell me why. 'Cause I don't want to know. I carried your heart when you needed me. That's just how our love was meant to be. I keep on tearing through these tragedies. I took the brunt of your shame and all your misery.
Yeah, so all of the tracks that I applied compression to, they all have like a bit more of like a more present vibe in the mix. The dynamics are controlled. Everything sounds better. You can more clearly hear each instrument in the mix. And again, this is not about making huge adjustments to every single instrument. This is about making small changes to certain key instruments to make the mix sound better. I know this is not an advanced mixing tutorial or anything, but you can really do a lot with just EQ and compression and using some gentle EQ and compression adjustments. Now, there's more to the compressor than just what I've shown in this video. There are sidechain filter options. There's a sidechain input. So we'll talk about those things in a future video. But for now, I think that's a good overview of the compressor, and hopefully you can use some of these techniques to control the dynamics and shape the dynamics in your recordings. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. As always, thank you so much for the support, and thanks for watching.